The social worker's pen scratched against the clipboard with a sound that felt too loud in the cramped office. 22 years. That's how long I'd been a ward of the state. And this was how it ended. A manila envelope. A handshake that lasted exactly 2 seconds, and a door closing behind me with a finality that made my stomach drop. My name is Marcus Hayes, and 3 weeks after turning 19, I was officially aging out of Oak Ridge Group home in Portland, Oregon. The state didn't care that I had nowhere to go, no job lined up, no safety net waiting to catch me. I was an adult now, which apparently meant I was someone else's problem, or nobody's problem at all. Mr. Dawson, the facility director, had handed me the envelope with the kind of practiced indifference that comes from doing this too many times. "Your documents are all here, Marcus," he'd said, barely glancing up from his computer screen. "Birth certificate, medical history, school records. Everything we have on file." I already knew what wouldn't be in there, any real answers about where I came from. I'd been found in the emergency room of Providence Hospital when I was 6 months old, left in a waiting room chair with nothing but a note pinned to my blanket that read, "His name is Marcus. Please help him." No last name, no explanation, no trail to follow back to whoever decided they couldn't keep me. I'd stopped asking questions about my origins around age 12, when I realized the answers either didn't exist or nobody cared enough to look for them. I sat on the front steps of Oak Ridge that last morning, the envelope resting on my knees, and finally opened it. The usual paperwork stared back at me, bureaucratic and impersonal. Vaccination records that tracked every shot I'd received since infancy. Report cards showing I was an average student who never caused trouble, but never stood out either. A psychologist's evaluation from when I was 14 that used words like guarded and difficulty forming attachments. Nothing I didn't already know. Then, at the very bottom of the stack, I found something that made my breath catch. A smaller envelope, cream-colored and worn at the edges, with my name written across the front in faded blue ink. Just Marcus in handwriting that looked old-fashioned, careful, like whoever wrote it had taken their time. My hands shook slightly as I turned it over. The seal had been broken long ago, but the envelope had been carefully tucked into my file and forgotten. Or maybe not forgotten, maybe kept until I was old enough to handle whatever was inside. I pulled out 2 items. The first was a photograph, black and white, showing a woman who looked to be in her 70s, standing in front of a ranch house. She wore jeans and a work shirt, her grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, and she was smiling at the camera with an expression that seemed both proud and sad at the same time. Behind her, I could see wooden fences, open fields, and mountains in the distance. The second item was a key. Not a modern key, but an old brass one with an ornate head and a worn leather tag attached by a thin cord. Stamped into the leather, barely legible after years of handling, were 2 words, Clearwater Ranch. I flipped the photograph over. On the back, in that same careful handwriting, was a message. For Marcus, when he's grown, the ranch remembers even if the world forgets. Come home. E.H. E.H. The initials meant nothing to me. I stared at the photograph, searching the woman's face for any resemblance to my own. Did we have the same nose, the same shape to our eyes? It was impossible to tell from the grainy image, but something in her expression felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. I pulled out my phone, the cheap prepaid one the state had given me as a parting gift, and typed Clearwater Ranch into the search bar. For several minutes, nothing useful came up. Just general hits about various ranches with similar names scattered across the western states. Then I refined my search, adding Oregon and Eastern Oregon to narrow it down. Finally, a result appeared. A small mention in a historical archive for Harney County described Clearwater Ranch as a cattle operation that had been in the Hayes family for 3 generations before being sold at auction in 2019. Hayes, my last name. The name the hospital had assigned me when I was found because I needed a last name for the paperwork. Had someone known? Had someone at the hospital or child services made a connection and never told me? Or was it just a coincidence, a cruel joke the universe was playing? The article mentioned that the ranch had covered nearly 800 acres near a town called Druzy, about 4 hours southeast of Portland. It said the property had been sold after the last owner, Eleanor Hayes, passed away at age 84 with no living relatives to claim the estate. Eleanor Hayes. E.H. I looked at the photograph again, at the woman's weathered hands resting on the fence post, at the way she stood like she was rooted to that land. If this was Eleanor, and if she'd left me this key and this message, then she'd known about me. She'd known I existed even though we'd never met. The question was why she'd never come for me, and what she expected me to do with a key to a ranch that had been sold years ago. I sat there on those steps for another hour, turning the key over in my hands, feeling its weight. $53 in my pocket, a duffel bag with everything I owned, and a key to a place I'd never heard of that might hold the only answers I'd ever get about who I was and where I came from. Finally, I stood up, shouldered my bag, and started walking. I didn't have a plan beyond getting to Druzy and finding Clearwater Ranch. Maybe the new owners would let me look around. Maybe someone in town would remember Eleanor Hayes and could tell me why she'd left me a key instead of a life. It was a thin thread to follow, but it was the only one I had. The city bus could get me to the Greyhound station downtown. From there, I'd figure out the rest. I'd been figuring things out on my own for as long as I could remember. This would just be one more thing. The Greyhound station smelled like cleaning solution, trying to mask the underlying scent of too many people passing through too quickly. I bought a ticket to Burns, the closest town to Druzy that the bus actually served, and it cost me $38. That left me with $15, a granola bar, and a bottle of water for the next 4 hours. I chose a seat near the back and pressed my forehead against the window as the bus pulled out of Portland and headed east. The city gave way to suburbs, then to farmland, then to high desert that stretched out in shades of brown and sage green under a sky so big it made my chest tight. I'd never been this far from Portland before. The group home had organized a few field trips over the years, beach visits and trips to the zoo, but we'd never ventured into this part of Oregon where the land felt ancient and empty in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. I pulled out the photograph again, studying it in the afternoon light, filtering through the dirty bus window. Eleanor Hayes looked like someone who'd worked hard her entire life. There was a strength in her posture, in the set of her shoulders, that reminded me of the way some of the older staff at Oak Ridge carried themselves. People who'd seen too much but kept going anyway. If she was family, if she'd known about me, why had she never reached out? Why leave me in the system to bounce between foster homes and group placements when she had a ranch, land, a place I could have belonged? The anger surprised me. I'd spent so many years telling myself I didn't care about the people who'd left me that I'd almost believed it. But sitting on that bus with her photograph in my hands, I realized I did care. I cared a lot, and part of me was furious that she'd known I existed and had chosen to stay away. The bus pulled into Burns just before 6 in the evening. It wasn't much of a town, just a main street with a few businesses, a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s, and a gas station where a handful of pickup trucks were parked. I stepped off the bus with my duffel bag and stood on the sidewalk, completely out of my element. A couple of people glanced at me as they passed, their expressions curious but not hostile. I must have looked exactly like what I was, a city kid who had no business being here. I walked into the diner because it was the only place that looked open and warm. A bell chimed above the door as I entered, and a woman behind the counter looked up from pouring coffee. She was maybe 50, with short red hair and a name tag that read, Diane. "Help you, honey?" she asked, setting down the coffee pot. I approached the counter and set my bag down by my feet. "I'm looking for information about a place called Clearwater Ranch. It's supposed to be near Druzy." Her expression shifted immediately, surprise flickering across her face. Clearwater. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a while. That place has been empty for years. Why are you looking for it? I hesitated, then pulled out the photograph and the key, setting them on the counter between us. Someone left these for me. The woman in the picture, Eleanor Hayes. I think she might have been family, but I don't know for sure. I'm just trying to understand why she left me this. Diane picked up the photograph, her eyes softening as she looked at it. Eleanor, she said quietly. God, I haven't seen her face in years. She used to come into town once a month for supplies, kept to herself mostly, but she was kind, always tipped well and asked about people's families. She handed the photo back to me. She died about 5 years ago. I heard the ranch was sold at auction not long after. I don't know who bought it, but I can tell you how to get there if you want. It's about 20 miles south of here, down Highway 205. 20 miles. I had $15 and no car. Diane must have seen the calculation on my face because she smiled gently. Tell you what, my shift ends in about an hour. I can drive you out there. It's not far, and I'm curious now. Eleanor never mentioned family. Most folks around here thought she was alone in the world. Relief washed through me. Thank you. Really. I don't know what I'm going to find out there, but I have to look. She nodded and gestured to an empty booth. Sit down. Let me get you something to eat while you wait. You look like you haven't had a decent meal in a while. She was right. I ordered a burger and fries, and when she brought it out, she refused to let me pay. Eleanor would have wanted someone to help you, she said simply. Consider it her treat. I ate slowly, making the food last, and watched through the window as the sun began to set behind the mountains. The sky turned shades of orange and pink that I'd never seen in the city, colors so vivid they almost didn't look real. For the first time since leaving Oak Ridge, I felt something other than fear and uncertainty. I felt a strange pull, like something was waiting for me out there in the desert, something that had been waiting for a long time. When Diane's shift ended, she led me to an old Subaru parked behind the diner. We drove south on Highway 205, the road stretching straight and empty ahead of us. She talked about Eleanor as we drove, filling in pieces of a story I'd never known. She lost her husband young, Diane said. Some kind of accident on the ranch when he was in his 40s. After that, it was just her running the whole operation. She had help from hired hands, but she was the one making all the decisions. Tough as nails, that woman, but fair. People respected her. Did she ever mention a son or daughter? I asked, my voice tight. Diane shook her head slowly. Not that I ever heard, but Eleanor was private about her personal life. There could have been things she never talked about. Loss has a way of making people close up, you know. After about 30 minutes, Diane slowed and turned onto a gravel road that was barely marked. A weathered wooden sign, half-fallen and covered in lichen, read Clearwater Ranch, in letters that had once been painted white but were now mostly faded to bare wood. My heart started pounding as we drove down the long driveway. The landscape opened up before us, fields of dried grass stretching toward distant mountains, and there, at the center of it all, stood a house. It was a single-story ranch house with a wraparound porch, painted white but peeling in places. Next to it stood a large red barn, its roof intact but clearly showing years of weathering. Fences crisscrossed the property, some sections still standing, others sagging or fallen, and everything, all of it, was bathed in the golden light of sunset, making it look like something out of a dream or a memory I'd never actually had. Diane put the car in park and looked at me. "You okay?" I nodded, unable to speak. This was it. This was the place Eleanor had wanted me to find. The place she'd left me a key to, even though I had no idea what door it might open. I've made it this far in Marcus's journey, and I'm dying to know what you think happens next. Does he find answers inside that ranch house? Do you believe Eleanor was his grandmother, or is there more to the story? Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me your theory. Have you ever stood at the threshold of something that could change your whole life? Maybe it was a letter, a phone call, or a place you finally found the courage to visit. Share your story with us. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in searching for answers is exactly what we need to keep going. Now, Let's see what Marcus discovers when he steps inside. I stepped out of the car and stood there for a long moment, just breathing. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, with hints of sage and dry earth and something else I couldn't name. The wind moved across the open fields with a sound like whispered conversations, and in the distance I could hear the faint call of a bird I didn't recognize. Diane came to stand beside me, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets. "You want me to wait?" she asked. I shook my head. "I don't know how long I'll be. You've already done so much." She studied me for a moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out a business card with the diner's phone number written on it. "Call me when you're ready. I don't care what time it is. You shouldn't be out here alone with no way back." I took the card, my throat tight with gratitude I didn't know how to express. "Thank you, Diane, really." She squeezed my shoulder once, then got back in her car and drove away, leaving me standing in front of Clearwater Ranch with nothing but a key and a photograph and more questions than I'd started with. I walked slowly toward the house, my boots crunching on gravel that hadn't seen regular traffic in years. The porch steps creaked under my weight, but they held. Up close, I could see more details. Wind chimes hung silent and still near the door. A rocking chair sat in the corner, its paint faded by sun and weather, and next to the front door was a lockbox, the kind realtors use, hanging on the doorknob. My stomach sank. Of course, the ranch had been sold. Someone else owned it now. I was trespassing on property that didn't belong to me, chasing ghosts and mysteries that might not even exist. But I'd come this far. I tried the lockbox anyway, hoping maybe it had been left unlocked or forgotten. It rattled, but didn't open. Then, almost as an afterthought, I tried the brass key Eleanor had left me. It didn't fit the lockbox, but when I tried it in the front door itself, something clicked. The key slid in smoothly, like it had been waiting, and when I turned it, the lock opened with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet evening. My hands were shaking as I pushed the door open. It swung inward with a low creak, revealing a dark interior that smelled of dust and closed-up spaces. I stepped inside and felt along the wall for a light switch. When I flipped it, nothing happened. The electricity had been shut off, which made sense for an abandoned property, but enough twilight came through the windows that I could see the main room. It was exactly what you'd expect from a ranch house. Hardwood floors covered in a thin layer of dust, a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. Furniture covered with white sheets that gave everything a ghostly appearance. Built-in shelves lined with books whose titles I couldn't read in the dim light, and everywhere, on every available surface, were photographs in frames. I moved closer to the nearest shelf, pulling out my phone and using its flashlight to see better. The photographs showed the ranch in different seasons and different decades. Eleanor as a younger woman, standing with a tall man who must have been her husband. The same man working with horses, fixing fences, laughing at the camera. Then photographs of Eleanor alone, older in each successive image, but always with that same quiet strength in her expression. And then I found them, a series of photographs tucked together on a lower shelf, partially hidden behind larger frames. They showed a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with dark hair and a shy smile. In some photos, she was visibly pregnant. In others, she was holding a baby. Me. It had to be me. I picked up one of the frames with trembling hands, bringing it close to my phone's light. The photograph showed the young woman sitting in the rocking chair I'd just seen on the porch, holding an infant wrapped in a blue blanket. On the back of the frame, written in Eleanor's handwriting, was a date and a note. Sarah and Marcus, 3 weeks old, my daughter and my grandson. I pray I'm doing the right thing, Sarah. My mother's name was Sarah, and Eleanor wasn't just some distant relative. She was my grandmother. I sank down onto the sheet-covered couch, still holding the photograph, trying to process what I was learning. Eleanor had known exactly who I was. She'd had pictures of me as a baby, so why hadn't she kept me? Why had I ended up in a hospital waiting room and then in the system? I forced myself to stand up and keep searching. There had to be more. Eleanor had left me that key for a reason, had written, "Come home" on the back of her photograph. She'd wanted me to find this place and learn something. I moved through the house methodically, checking every room. The kitchen had outdated appliances and dishes still in the cabinets. A bedroom that must have been Eleanor's, with a simple bed and a dresser covered in dust. Another bedroom that looked like it had belonged to a young woman, Sarah's room, with faded posters on the walls and books on a shelf. And then, in what looked like a small office at the back of the house, I found what I'd been looking for. A desk sat against one wall, and on top of it was a large envelope with my name written across it in Eleanor's careful handwriting. Marcus Hayes, in letters that were slightly shaky, written by hands that had aged since the photograph on the porch was taken. I sat down in the desk chair, dust puffing up around me, and opened the envelope. Inside were several documents. The first was a letter, multiple pages written in that same handwriting, and I began to read. "My dear Marcus," it started, "if you're reading this, then you found your way here, which means you're braver and more resourceful than I probably gave you credit for. I'm sorry I'm not there to meet you in person, to explain things properly, but I'm 83 years old as I write this, and I know my time is running out. There's so much I need to tell you, and I'm terrified I won't find the right words, but I have to try." The letter continued, and with each paragraph, the story unfolded. Sarah had been Eleanor's only child, born late in life when Eleanor was already 42. She'd been a quiet, sensitive girl who'd struggled to fit in at school and had always felt more comfortable with animals than people. When she was 21, she'd gotten involved with a man passing through town, someone Eleanor had never trusted, someone who'd left the moment Sarah told him she was pregnant. "I told her we'd figure it out together," Eleanor wrote. "I told her the ranch was big enough for all of us, that we'd raise you here where you could grow up with space and fresh air and family." But Sarah was ashamed. She thought she'd disappointed me, thought she'd ruined her life. And she was scared of what people in town would say. Small towns can be cruel to unmarried mothers, even now. So she left. She took the truck one night while I was sleeping and drove to Portland. By the time I tracked her down 3 months later, she was already sick. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. She had postpartum depression that went untreated because she had no insurance and no support system, the letter continued. It developed into something worse, something the doctors called postpartum psychosis. She wasn't thinking clearly, Marcus. She loved you desperately, but her mind was breaking, and she didn't know how to ask for help. One night, in a moment of crisis, she left you at the hospital because she was terrified she might hurt you. She called me afterwards, sobbing, saying she'd done something terrible, but it was the only way to keep you safe. I had to stop reading for a moment, pressing my palms against my eyes. My mother hadn't abandoned me because she didn't want me. She'd been sick, alone, and trying to protect me, the only way her fractured mind could conceive. "I drove to Portland immediately," Eleanor's letter went on. "I was going to bring you home, Marcus. I was going to raise you myself, but by the time I got there, Sarah had disappeared. And when I went to the hospital to find you, Child Services wouldn't tell me anything. They said an investigation was ongoing, that I'd need to prove my relationship to you, that there were procedures and protocols. I tried, Marcus. God knows I tried. I hired a lawyer with money we didn't have. I filled out forms and attended meetings and begged them to let me take you home. But I was 63 years old, living alone on a failing ranch, and Sarah had never listed me as next of kin on any paperwork. They said I wasn't a suitable guardian. They said you'd be better off in a stable foster placement with younger parents." The anger in her words was palpable even through the old ink. "I fought for 2 years, and then Sarah died, overdosed on pills in a motel room in Seattle, and even that didn't change their minds. They said I was too old, too isolated, too financially unstable, so I made a different choice. I made a different choice," the letter continued. "If they wouldn't let me raise you, then I'd make sure you had something waiting for you when you were old enough to find it yourself. I sold half the herd and most of the equipment. I stopped taking vacations and cut every expense I could. and I put aside every penny I could spare into a trust fund that would become yours when you turned 19. I also made arrangements with a lawyer in Burns to ensure that Clearwater Ranch would be held for you, that it couldn't be sold at auction until you'd had a chance to claim it. But I needed you to find it yourself, Marcus. I needed you to want to come here, to seek out your history, because if you didn't care enough to look, then the ranch wouldn't mean anything to you anyway. So I left you the key and the photograph, and I prayed that someday you'd be curious enough or desperate enough to follow the trail I'd laid out. I set the letter down for a moment, my hands shaking too badly to hold it steady. Eleanor hadn't given up on me. She'd spent years fighting for me, and when the system defeated her, she'd found another way to give me something, to make sure I knew I'd come from somewhere, that I'd been wanted. I picked up the letter again, forcing myself to keep reading. "There's more you need to know," Eleanor had written. "The ranch is yours, Marcus, completely and legally yours. The auction that everyone thinks happened in 2019 was staged. My lawyer, a man named Thomas Brennan in Burns, helped me set it up to look like the property had been sold, to keep it off people's radar, to prevent squatters or the county from seizing it for back taxes. But the deed has been in a trust with your name on it since you were 7 years old. All you have to do is contact Thomas, show him the key and this letter, and he'll transfer everything to you officially." My vision swam. The ranch was mine. Not sold, not lost. Mine. 800 acres of high desert land, a house, a barn, and a history that suddenly felt real and solid in a way nothing in my life ever had before. "I wish I could be there to show you around," Eleanor continued, "to teach you how to work the land, to introduce you to the neighbors who still remember what this place used to be. But since I can't, I'm leaving you everything I can. In the desk drawer, you'll find the deed, bank statements showing what's left in the trust, about $27,000 after lawyer fees and property taxes, and a journal I kept for you. I wrote in it every year on your birthday, telling you about the ranch, about Sarah, about what I hoped you were doing and who you were becoming. I know you probably hate me for not being there, for letting you grow up in the system when you had family who wanted you. But I hope someday you'll understand that I did what I thought was best with the impossible choices I was given." The letter ended with a paragraph that broke something open in my chest. "You come from strong people, Marcus. People who worked this land for 3 generations, who survived droughts and economic collapses and personal tragedies. You have that same strength in you, even if you don't know it yet. This ranch is yours to do with as you please. Sell it, keep it, burn it to the ground if that's what you need. But know that it's here. Know that you have a place in this world that's yours by right, not by charity or luck. Know that you were loved, even from a distance, even when it wasn't enough. Come home, Marcus. It's been waiting for you." It was signed simply, "Your grandmother, Eleanor Hayes." I sat in that dusty office for a long time, holding the letter and crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since I was a kid. Not sad tears exactly, but something more complicated. Grief for everything that had been lost, for the childhood I could have had here, for Eleanor and Sarah who'd both died before I could know them. But also relief. The overwhelming relief of finally having answers, of knowing I hadn't been thrown away like garbage, but had been loved by people who'd fought for me in the only ways they could. When I finally pulled myself together, I opened the desk drawer Eleanor had mentioned. Inside was exactly what she'd promised, the property deed with my name listed as the beneficiary of the Eleanor Hayes Trust. Bank statements showing deposits made regularly over 18 years, small amounts at first, then larger as Eleanor sold off pieces of the operation. And a leather-bound journal, thick with years of entries. I opened the journal to the first page. "Marcus's first birthday," it read. "He's 1 year old today, and I wonder if anyone is celebrating with him. I hope his foster family is kind. I hope they're giving him cake and singing to him. I made a cake here too, just chocolate from a box mix, and I put 1 candle on it and made a wish for him. I wished that he'd grow up healthy and strong, and that someday he'd forgive me for not being able to keep him safe." I flipped through the pages, reading entries from birthdays 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 19. Each one filled with Eleanor's hopes for me, her regrets, her descriptions of what was happening on the ranch that year. She'd created a chronicle of a life I should have lived, a record of all the birthdays we should have celebrated together. On my 10th birthday, she wrote about teaching me to ride horses, even though I wasn't there. On my 15th, she wrote about the conversations she wished we could have about becoming a man, about finding your place in the world. On my 18th, she wrote, "If my calculations are right, Marcus ages out of the system this year or next. I pray he finds the key. I pray he comes home. I'm not sure how much time I have left, and I need to know he's going to be okay." I closed the journal carefully, unable to read more without completely falling apart. Instead, I gathered up the documents, the letter, and the journal, and walked back through the house. The sun had fully set now, and the interior was dark, except for the beam of my phone's flashlight. I made my way to the living room and sat down in what must have been Eleanor's chair, a worn recliner positioned to face the window that looked out over the fields. And I let myself imagine, just for a moment, what it would have been like, growing up here with Eleanor, learning to work the land, having a grandmother who told me stories and taught me things and made chocolate cake on my birthday, having a place to belong, roots that went deep into this high desert soil. The anger I'd felt earlier was still there, anger at a system that had kept me from my family, at circumstances that had made it impossible for Sarah to be my mother, at the unfairness of it all. But underneath the anger was something else, gratitude. Eleanor had given me everything she could. She'd fought for me when it mattered, and when fighting wasn't enough, she'd created a path for me to find my way home. She'd made sure I'd have something solid to stand on when I was finally old enough to claim it. I pulled out Diane's business card and called the diner. She answered on the second ring. "Marcus, are you okay?" "I'm okay," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I expected. "I found what I needed to find, but I think I'm going to stay here tonight if that's all right. I'll call you tomorrow." There was a pause. Then Diane said, "The electricity is shut off out there. Do you have supplies, food, water?" I hadn't thought about any of that. "I'll figure it out," I said. "I've got a sleeping bag in my duffel. I'll be fine." "Give me 45 minutes, she said firmly. "I'm bringing you supplies. Don't argue." She hung up before I could protest. True to her word, Diane showed up less than an hour later with bags of groceries, bottles of water, a camping lantern, and extra blankets. She helped me carry everything inside and showed me where the well was in case I needed water for washing. "You're really staying?" she asked, looking around the dark house. I nodded. "This is my home. I just didn't know it until today." She smiled, and there was understanding in her eyes. "Eleanor would be glad you came. She talked about you sometimes near the end. She'd come into the diner and sit at the counter, and sometimes she'd mention her grandson in Portland, wonder how you were doing. I didn't realize then that you didn't know about her." "I wish I had," I said quietly. Diane squeezed my arm. "You're here now. That's what matters." After she left, I set up camp in the living room. I pushed aside the sheet-covered furniture and rolled out my sleeping bag near the fireplace. I ate a sandwich Diane had made, drank some water, and sat in the glow of the camping lantern, looking at Eleanor's photograph. Tomorrow I'd go to Burns and meet with the lawyer. I'd sign whatever papers needed to be signed and officially become the owner of Clearwater Ranch. Then I'd start figuring out what came next, whether I'd try to work the land or sell it, or just live here quietly while I figured out who I was and what I wanted. I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the dusty windows and the sound of wind moving through the fields. For a moment I forgot where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The ranch, Eleanor, the letter. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my body stiff from sleeping on the hardwood floor, and looked around the living room in the full light of day. It looked different now, less haunted and more just neglected. The furniture under the sheets was solid and well made. The floors, beneath the dust, were beautiful hardwood that would shine if they were cleaned. The stone fireplace had a mantel lined with more photographs I hadn't noticed in the dark. This wasn't just a place where people had lived. It was a home where people had loved and worked and built a life, and now it was mine to either restore or let go. I made myself a breakfast of granola bars and warm water from the bottles Diane had brought, then walked outside to really see the property in daylight. The view took my breath away. The ranch stretched out in every direction, fields of dried grass dotted with sagebrush, fences that created a patchwork across the landscape, and beyond it all, mountains that looked purple in the morning light. I walked down to the barn and found it filled with old equipment, hay bales that had decomposed into dust, and a workbench covered in tools that hadn't been touched in years. There was a tractor that looked like it might still run with some work, and a truck from the 1990s parked under a lean-to, its tires flat, but its body relatively intact. Eleanor had left everything exactly as it was, preserved like a museum of her life. I spent the morning exploring every corner of the property. I found the well Diane had mentioned, still functioning. I discovered a small cemetery plot on a hill overlooking the main house, where Eleanor and her husband James were buried under simple granite markers. I stood there for a long time, hands in my pockets, talking to people I'd never met, but who'd shaped my entire existence. "I'm here," I said out loud, feeling foolish but needing to say it anyway. I found my way home. I'm sorry it took so long. The wind was my only answer, but somehow it felt like enough. Around noon, I walked back to the house, grabbed Eleanor's documents, and called Diane for a ride into Burns. She picked me up within 20 minutes, refusing again to let me offer gas money. "You're family now," she said simply. "That's what we do around here." Thomas Brennan's law office was above a hardware store on Main Street, accessed by an exterior staircase that looked older than I was. The office itself was cluttered with filing cabinets and stacks of paperwork, but Thomas himself was neat and organized, a man in his early 70s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Marcus Hayes," he said, studying me carefully. "Eleanor told me you'd come eventually. She never doubted it, even when years passed and nothing happened. She said you'd find your way when you were ready." I showed him the key, the letter, and the photograph. He nodded, pulled out a file that had my name on it, and spent the next 2 hours walking me through everything. The property deed, the trust account, the taxes that had been paid through arrangements Eleanor had made before she died, the staged auction that had kept the county from seizing the land. "Everything is in order," Thomas said finally. "I just need you to sign here and here and here, and the ranch transfers to you completely. No lines, no debts, just land and buildings and whatever Eleanor left inside the house." My hand shook slightly as I signed my name over and over. Marcus Hayes, the name that had been assigned to me randomly by a hospital intake worker 22 years ago. The name that turned out to be my actual family name. The universe had a strange sense of humor sometimes. When it was done, Thomas handed me a folder with copies of everything and a set of keys I hadn't seen before. "These are for the truck and the tractor," he said. "Eleanor had me keep them safe. The truck probably needs a new battery and fresh tires, but the engine was solid last time it ran. The tractor's been sitting longer, but it's a tough old machine. With some work you might get it going." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "What are you going to do with the place, if you don't mind me asking?" I realized I'd been thinking about that question since I woke up. "I'm going to stay," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. "I'm going to fix it up, learn how to work the land, maybe not as a full cattle operation like Eleanor ran, but something. I need to understand what she left me, what I come from. I've spent my whole life feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. This is the first place that's ever felt like it might be home." Thomas smiled, genuine warmth in his expression. "Eleanor would be proud. She always said this land had a way of healing people if they let it. If you need help, there are folks around here who remember her fondly. They'd be willing to teach you things. Lend a hand." I thanked him and left his office with the folder clutched to my chest, feeling like I was carrying something precious and fragile. The ranch was legally mine now. No one could take it away. No social worker could decide I didn't deserve it. No system could tell me I wasn't good enough. It was mine because Eleanor had wanted it to be mine, had spent years making sure it would be. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into making the ranch livable. I used some of the trust money to get the electricity turned back on and the well pump serviced. I hired a handyman from town to help fix the roof and replace broken windows. I spent days scrubbing floors, washing walls, and dragging sheet-covered furniture outside to air out in the sun. Diane brought me meals and introduced me to neighbors who stopped by with offers of help and stories about Eleanor. A man named Frank, who'd worked on the ranch 30 years ago, showed me how to get the tractor running and taught me basic maintenance. A couple named Pete and Linda, who owned the ranch to the north, invited me to dinner and explained the ins and outs of managing grazing land in high desert country. Slowly, the ranch came back to life, and so did I. I set up Eleanor's old bedroom as my own, keeping her quilt on the bed because it felt like a connection to her. I turned Sarah's room into an office where I could work on learning about ranch management through online courses. I spent my evenings reading Eleanor's journal from start to finish, getting to know her through her words, understanding the regrets and hopes and fierce love that had driven every decision she'd made. And every morning, I woke up to that huge sky and those endless fields, and I felt something I'd never felt before: peace. The anger I'd carried for so many years, the resentment about being abandoned and forgotten, started to fade. It didn't disappear completely. I don't think wounds like that ever fully heal, but it became something I could live with, because I understood now that I hadn't been unwanted. I'd been loved by people who'd been dealt impossible hands and had done the best they could with broken hearts and limited options. One afternoon in late spring, I was repairing a section of fence when a truck pulled up the driveway. A young woman about my age got out looking uncertain. "Hi," she called out. "I'm sorry to bother you. I heard someone was living here again. My name is Rachel Martinez. My grandmother was friends with Eleanor back in the day." I walked over, wiping my hands on my jeans. "I'm Marcus, Eleanor's grandson." Her face lit up. She had a grandson. She never said anything, but then Eleanor was always private about her personal life. My grandmother passed away last year, but she used to tell me stories about this place, about how beautiful it was when it was running full operation. She'd be happy to know someone's taking care of it again. We talked for a while, and Rachel told me about growing up in the area, about the challenges of ranch life and the surprising rewards. Before she left, she invited me to a community barbecue the following weekend. "It's how folks around here get to know each other," she said, "and you should meet people. You're part of this community now, whether you know it or not." That evening, I sat on the porch in Eleanor's rocking chair, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from a hospital waiting room to a children's group home to this vast stretch of high desert land that was now mine. I thought about Sarah, my mother, who'd loved me enough to let me go when her mind was breaking. About Eleanor, who'd fought the system and then found another way to give me a foundation when fighting wasn't enough. And I thought about the key, that small brass key that had unlocked so much more than just a door. It had unlocked a history, an identity, a place to stand and build from. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the sunset, the fields stretching out before me, the mountains in the distance. Then I opened a new note and started writing. Not for anyone else, but for myself, and maybe for some future version of me who might need to remember how this felt. "I'm home," I wrote. "After 22 years of not belonging anywhere, I'm finally home, not because of the land or the house or the money, though those things matter, but because I know now where I come from. I know that I was wanted, that I was loved, that people fought for me even when they couldn't win. Eleanor left me more than a ranch. She left me the truth, and that's worth more than anything." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear in that enormous sky, I felt something shift inside me. The constant restlessness I'd carried my entire life, the feeling of always being on the outside looking in, started to quiet. I wasn't fixed. I still had work to do, healing to finish, a future to figure out. But I had a foundation now. I had roots. I had a place that was mine, not because someone assigned it to me or allowed me to stay temporarily, but because it had been waiting for me all along. Clearwater Ranch wasn't just property. It was proof that I mattered, that my existence had meaning to people I'd never met, but who'd shaped everything I was becoming. And that was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you so much for following Marcus's journey from lost to found, from nowhere to home. If this story touched your heart, I'd be truly grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. It means the world to us and helps us keep sharing these stories of hope, resilience, and unexpected belonging. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered something about your past that completely changed how you saw yourself? Maybe it was a letter, a photograph, or a conversation that unlocked a piece of your history you didn't know was missing. Share your story with our community. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, might give them courage to search for their own answers or peace with the questions that have no answers. And tell me, what's the biggest lesson you're taking away from Marcus's story? For me, it's that love doesn't always show up in the ways we expect. Sometimes it's a grandmother fighting a system she couldn't beat. Sometimes it's a key left behind with a prayer that you'll find your way home. Sometimes it's land that waits patiently for decades until you're ready to claim it. Family isn't always about who raised you. Sometimes it's about who made sure you'd have something to come home to when you finally needed it most. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember that your story matters, wherever it begins and wherever it leads.